Hey, how are you? How's everyone doing this afternoon? It's great to have you here. Thanks a lot for joining us for the first of a series of several webcasts over the next few months on the future of work and learning and how COVID-19 has accelerated the future of work. My name's Simon Chan. I'm the VP of Talent, Academy, and Future of Work at Communitech, which is a not-for-profit private-public partnership that helps tech companies here in Waterloo Region start, grow, and succeed. At Communitech, we're working really hard to bring you businesses virtual and supporting our members as much as possible. Before we kick things off, I want to first take a moment to thank our courageous frontline workers for everything that they're doing for the community right now. A couple of housekeeping items, just so that you can immerse yourselves in this experience, is really around, first, the webcast is going to take about an hour. We're going to spend about 45 minutes to 50 minutes on content. We're going to reserve about 10 minutes for questions. I'd encourage you to share all of your questions in the Q&A function and join the conversation. Let's make this interactive. Use the chat functionality, share links, share your thoughts. We've got a couple of questions as well that we'll love your input on through the polling feature. And thanks in advance for your patience. We're all working through this new virtual world together. And we'll be sending a post-event email with the recording of this webcast, as well as a survey. And if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to email us. So I'm pleased to be able to be joined today by Katie Kitchen, who you can see lovely here on the screen. She's the head of HR for Manulife. Katie's great. Manulife and Katie were really one of the first to adopt the conversation around the future of work and learning. And it's really great to be able to co-host this session with her this afternoon. So what are we going to cover today? So I think our objective today is really to share with you what we've learned over the last year around the future of work, and then provide a bit of a perspective on how COVID's accelerating a number of these aspects as it relates to the future of work. We'll share with you our views on the impacts of COVID-19 in terms of the current crisis in the near term. What are some of the things we're thinking about as we look to recovery, and then give you a bit of a sense of maybe what might come through the new normal. And I recognize that organizations are at various different points, but that's part of this collaborative nature, is the ability to share with each other. We're also going to share a couple of live examples of things that are happening here in the region. And it's not just the region, it's happening across Canada, where companies are pivoting quickly, they're adapting as much as they can to serve their customers and their teams. And then finally, we're going to end on what does this really mean for organizations and community, and what might be a path forward for us to work together to shape the future of work. So let's get started. So I'm going to set the stage a bit. I wanted to give you a bit of background of how we got here, what we started about a year ago, and then kind of when we knew that life was going to be very different. So back in January, we had a small group of organizations in town, Manulife, the University of Waterloo, Deloitte, and Communitech, and we started talking about some of the opportunities and challenges to continue to grow the innovation and digital ecosystem. And really where we landed was around the top priorities were talent and how do we actually help shift the evolving workplace. So we did some research and we concluded that the challenge at hand around the future of work was really one that can't be tackled by any one organization. And so what we really needed to do was take a community-based approach to this. So what we decided to do was host a conversation with our community leaders, and we had this starting in January. And all we wanted to do was find out was who's working on this, who's thinking about this, and B, is there an interest in collaborating? Fast forward to March of this year, we had the good fortune of forming a coalition of 19 different organizations across academia, private, and public sector. And we were starting to advance our priorities and focus on what are some of the common things we wanted to tackle in the region. And in the process, we actually were starting to help two other communities, Halifax and Windsor, stand up their own future of work conversation. So it was actually the Windsor event, which took place on March 12th. So if you guys want to go backwards to what March 12th looked like, it was really that event and the drive home that really, where I realized that the future of work was really going to change and that our society was going to change at large. So, you know, the night before I'm driving in, I just finished coaching my son's U16 basketball game. And we were driving down with my colleague, Rachel, who's on the webinar here. And my son calls me on the phone and he says, "Dad, Rudy Gobert has COVID and the NBA is going to be shut down." So of course, usually with a 16-year-old, you're going to check to see, fact check whether he's actually telling the truth or not. But sure enough, my wife told me that that was indeed true. And so along that drive down to the 401, Rachel was checking her phone furiously, looking at all the different things that were closing. And then we saw Tom Hanks and Rita Wilson contracted COVID. And we knew that this was going to be something that was historical and life-changing in real time. So the next day, we actually had our community event, March 12th. It was awesome. We had 100 people show up. But really on that subsequent drive down is when we realized that things were going to change. Later that week, schools closed. Community Tech made the choice, as with many other organizations, to send their workforce, and we started working from home that Monday. And so that's really, what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about, give you a perspective on what I would call BC, before coronavirus, and AC, after coronavirus. I'll provide a bit of perspective of the thinking that we had before March 12th, and then Katie's going to provide a perspective on what life might look like post March 12th. So I'm going to turn it over to Katie, and she's going to go through some of the research that we've done along the way.
Thanks, Simon. It's really crazy to think about how far back March 12th was compared to where we are today and how fast things have changed. If we look at the market research that we had been analyzing and understanding over the past year, we thought when we started talking about the future work that we'd have a year or maybe 3 to get ready for some of the changes that some of our colleagues around the market were predicting. And coronavirus only accelerated that. So when we first started out, we thought for sure we would end up talking about changing career expectations, because we believed that, as Simon said, no organization, academic institution, small, medium, or large business could do this by themselves. Everybody has a unique voice to add to the mix as we figure out how to support changing career expectations. We're also expected to change how we work. So we know that 50% of companies are trying to figure out how to get machines and people to work side by side with each other in value creating ways. We know too, or we knew, that demographics were going to be shifting. So 2/3 of the workforce today is made up of mid-career, and I have the coronavirus coif where you can see my roots, and I'm squarely planted in that mid-career group. We currently make up 2/3 of the workforce. By 2025, millennials will do that. And with them, they bring experiences and assumptions and hopes and dreams that are different than my generation. And U of W did this really interesting study talking about the new workforce that's coming in. And what was fascinating there is they were saying 50% of them would not take a job, regardless of skills, income, et cetera, with an organization that didn't match their values. So we were thinking we had 3 years to figure out how not only does the demographic makeup of workplaces shift and evolve, but so too do cultures and organizational dynamics. Coronavirus has really only accelerated that. When we think about, Simon, if I can get you to, thank you. When we think about what coronavirus has done, it's accelerated on a couple of different fronts. One, remote work. Remote work is here to stay. The vast majority of folks are able to work from home. And what's interesting is that leaders are noting that it's not actually changing collaboration or the level of collaboration, innovation, et cetera. What is fascinating, though, is the way in which we lead our teams remotely will have to shift. Coronavirus also saw for us in a really stark way how many people needed EI straight out the gate when we declared the lockdown or the guidance to work from home as much as you could. How over 500,000 Canadians accessed EI benefits. So those would be our friends, our family, our neighbors. We're struggling to figure out, how do I put food on the table? How do I pay my rent? Only heighten the need for really quick reskilling in order to be able to find gainful employment in the organizations that we're hiring. And then if you think about it and pull back a little bit from a societal perspective, because we know Canadians are all one giant team working together, how do we respond to the coronavirus together so that no one is left behind? When we know that 16% of Canadians are citing a drop in their mental health, according to Morneau Chappelle, and we're seeing 20 to 30% increase in gender-based violence. How do we come together to make sure that no one is left behind? And with that, we're curious about your thoughts. How dramatic of a change have you experienced, either in mindset or behavior? Option A, no impact, I'm pretty good. 2, there's been a little. C, significant impact, over half of my work and personal life has shifted. Or D, this is a life moment for me. This is causing me to rethink how I approach work and life. We'll just give it a minute.
I feel like we should have some music in the background, Katie.
You could sing for us, Simon. You are exceptional. Okay, we'll just pop the poll response up. Thank you. So almost half of you are seeing significant impact in that half of your work and personal life has shifted, followed by many of you are saying this is a life moment for me. That's really interesting to hear, and we'll unpack that as we move through the webinar together. So thank you for sharing your thoughts there with us.
So it's really interesting, and I would echo kind of the survey results in terms of the fact that things have changed significantly. I'd love to know the 2% who had no life change. That is amazing level of adaptability. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a step back, and what I'm going to do is start from kind of the big picture and start off and talk about what are some of the large trends that are happening that are actually shaping the future of work. And then I'm going to spend some time defining what we think the future of work is. It's not the right definition, it's just a definition, because even before COVID-19, future of work was very much a buzzword and will, continue to be. And it's something that, I mean, you guys are probably intrigued by the title of this webcast. There's so much around the future of work today. So I want to give it a bit of shape and a bit of definition. So when you look at these trends, what you'll realize is that the trends aren't just trends that are impacting the workplace. These are many of the trends that we've been talking about that are already impacting businesses and already impacting our day-to-day lives. So the first one is the pace of change. We've heard a lot about this over the last several decades, that we're living in exponential times and things are changing at an exponential rate. And what's interesting is things have not been changing faster than ever, but if you really think about it, things are never going to be this slow again. So when you think about that, how do we actually keep up with the pace of change as we move forward? Katie talked a bit about demographics and the impacts of multiple generations in the workforce. And so this is going to be a very interesting way to move forward, because we're going to need to look at the various different attitudes and expectations of these workers. And it's much more diverse than it was before. And of course, there's the notion of what does even work-life balance and what does work-life integration even mean? So pace of change, demographics. The next one I would contend is a very interesting one around longevity, and it doesn't get talked enough about. In terms of longevity, if you haven't had a chance, I would check out someone called the research by someone by the name of Linda Grattan. She's from the School of Economics in London, and she wrote the book 100-Year Life. And basically within her book, she talks about the fact that if you're born today, you have a greater than 50% chance of living to 100. So when you think about 100-year life, what does that mean for your career? And what does that mean for your life when you have that amount of longevity? So in her book, she talks about 3 different personas, and she kind of unpacks them, and it's a really nice illustrative way of understanding where we are today. She looks at someone who's, led a very traditional career path, is probably a boomer and is about to retire, and what their perspective is. Someone who has led probably a bit of a traditional career path, but is looking over the edge and seeing that there's something changing as we approach the way work is happening and as careers evolve. And that's probably someone like me who's, kind of mid-career, and then someone who's just embarking on their career. What's their perspective in this, when looking at how careers and how the work is being shaped? And so that is another, that confluence of the pace of change, demographics, and the 100-year life is largely what we talked about. But now we introduce this 4th megatrend of the global pandemic. And I would contend that the 3 megatrends that you saw before, plus the global pandemic, is going to reshape, accelerate, and really change the way we work. So how do we bring it all together? So I really like this visual by Heather McGowan, and Heather's actually going to be our next webinar keynote. She's amazing. I'll talk about her a little bit more in a few moments. But this is a really interesting way of bringing together the relationship between longevity and the pace of change. And what you can see on this is that we talked today about how we're kind of in the early days of the 4th industrial revolution. If you look back to the 1st industrial revolution, when you had the steam engine, and we went to electricity, and we went to the internet, what you can see is that we had multiple lifetimes to deal with that paradigm shift, because longevity was, you lived till you were 38 or 40. And you only had one paradigm shift to deal with. If you think about where we are today, and I think if you look moving forward, we would agree that you're probably going to have to deal with multiple paradigm shifts within one's lifetime. And I would argue that our infrastructure, the way we work and the way we deal with things isn't ready to keep pace with this type of change. So how do we actually adapt our models, whether it be business, community, or as individuals, to sense these emerging trends and get ahead of some of these trends? So let's talk a little bit about how we define the future of work and learning. Again, this is not the right definition, this is a definition. And so when we think about the future of work and learning, how we think about it is, it's really about the disruption of the workforce, so changes to the workforce, changes to the workplace, and changes to learning, those three areas. And really what's happening is the relationship between the workforce and the workplace is becoming much more ambiguous. And we'd argue that we really need to champion adaptability and continuous learning to be able to ensure that these relationships continue to hold. So from a workplace perspective, over the last while, what we've seen is that different personas get impacted by different things, but they're impacted by things like the expectations are changing from a career perspective. They've got multiple career transitions. Career paths are being fragmented. And so, things like mental health and self-care are becoming more and more of issues and challenges. As it relates to the workplace within industries, what we're seeing is different industries are being impacted different ways. So whether it's industries or size of organizations, those industries are being impacted by the changes in physical work, technology, and culture. And then what knits it all together is this whole change in learning. From a workforce perspective, we contend that really you need to think through lifelong learning, and from a workplace perspective, organizations are going to have to become much more around learning organizations and adapting to the environment that's around them. And then learning is going to change because I think there's going to be this large rise in work integrated learning where we look at much more practical hands-on learning to move forward. So that's, again, how we look at defining the aspects of the future of work. So what I'm going to do now is actually spend a bit of time over the next few minutes unpacking the changes that we see from what we think of as kind of our current model today, and what's the emerging model for the workforce, the workplace, and learning. And the slides that I'm going to go through are actually the slides that I went through with the community in Windsor on March 12th. And so what I want you to do is, as I'm going through these slides, think about the things that I'm talking about and what areas have been accelerated by COVID. And then when we turn it back over to Katie, it'll be interesting to see the things that you've observed versus the things that she's observed and the other members of our coalition here in Waterloo Region have observed as the impacts of COVID. So these are our very pretty models, and they are illustrative purposes only. So this is not scientifically proven, but this is just a visual of the things that we've heard as we've done our research over the last year. So from a workforce perspective, I would argue that we largely still live in very much a three-stage model, where you go to school, you work, and you work for maybe an employer, two employers, or within a sector, and then you hard stop retire, and then you hang out and sip pina coladas, like they say in the commercials, for the next 5-10 years. What I would contend is that we're seeing a model that's emerging where longevity is much longer. So it's the 100-year life. This one is to 90. And I think we're moving from a three-stage life to a multi-stage life, and a life where we see multiple transitions, right? Because people are going to move in and out of different forms of work, different ways of working, et cetera. If you're going to, if you're going to have to live till you're 90, you're going to probably have to fund that, your savings or retirement for much longer. And so I would argue that if you're going to be working a 50-year career, taking a gap year may not be crazy. You're seeing more people look at sabbaticals as an option to spend time with aging parents or young children. So you're going to see these different forms of works, including the much talked about freelance and gig work, which might be a side hustle, or it may be something that you do as a vocation. When we look at, I know there's a lot of benefits and retirement professionals in the audience, so this one's for you. So I think that the actual infrastructure that we look at when it comes to health and wealth is going to change. Currently, a lot of our benefits is tied to our employer, and we still talk a lot about debt reduction and this steady savings that you're going to accumulate, and then you're going to hard stop retire at 65 and take money out. What I would contend is if you looked at the previous emerging workforce model, you're going to see a lot more income volatility because people are moving in and out of different forms of work. And so I think you're going to see more savings withdrawal, and more income volatility. And I'd suggest that we don't really have a system today that actually aligns with that. as you see more and more freelancers and transitions to other different forms of work, how are benefits that are tied to employers, how do those need to shift? And then, there's a new stage that I'll introduce. A friend of mine named Mike Drack wrote a book called Victory Lap Retirement. And what he contends is that the full stop retirement doesn't make sense anymore. And actually, people actually need to rethink that hard stop retirement in a way that they've crossed the finish line when they've become financially independent, and that they're actually doing things that they enjoy while being able to earn a bit of an income to supplement their retirement. Again, that might change significantly given where we are around COVID, but again, these are some of the models that we were talking about pre-COVID. Learning, I think learning is going to change dramatically. We, again, typically think of learning as you go to school and you kind of, dine out on your 4-year university or college degree, and then you have some in-house workplace training. The model that I think we see emerging is much more around more work integrated learning, but more bursts of learning. If you think about that shift in the different paradigms that we're talking about, I think we need to think about how we continue to learn continuously through our careers. But no one is going to want to go back and do a 4-year degree, right? So I think you see this emergence of these micro-credentials and smaller bursts of learnings to gain skills that we need. Could be digital marketing, could be AI fundamentals, but I think you're going to see this way of adopting small bursts of learning, and how do we create the infrastructure to support that? And then, of course, there's self-directed learning, the increase in rise in self-directed learning. When I do this in audiences, I usually ask them how many people listen to podcasts or YouTube on a regular basis, and about half the people put their hands up. When you ask them how many of their kids do that, 100% of people put their hands up. So it's changing quite dramatically. And then all of these things are influencing the workplace, how we look at physical space, how we look at culture. These are all things that are evolving and changing from a much more prescribed and formal and fixed model where one size fits all, to a model where it's much more fluid, more informal, and much more personalized, I think you're going to see going forward. And the whole notion of, we need to retain our employees, and if they're loyal, they leave, I think that's going to go out the window to be much more focused on more of an alumni type model that you would see in universities, where you provide them with a great experience while they're there, and when they leave, they're brand ambassadors for your organization. So what does this all mean? So what does this really mean for workforces, workplaces, and communities? So I think really for workforces, I think we talked about the fact that you need to become a lifelong learner. You need to become much more adaptable and resilient and entrepreneurial to navigate the ambiguity that's in front of us. And then also, I think with the rise of AI and automation, you're going to see a need for those human skills. So those things that really separate us from machines around complex problem solving, innovation, empathy, I think you're going to see those as areas of emphasis as we move forward. From a workplace perspective, a lot of organizations are talking about customer-centric or being centered around the customer. I think we're going to see a movement towards employee centricity and employee experience that are much more personalized than the way they are today. And then I would contend that organizations need to become more learning organizations that are able to adapt. And they're going to have to figure out their purpose and their mission, because as Katie pointed out, I think those are going to be table stakes in order to attract the talent of the future. In communities, we're going to talk a lot about collaboration as a way forward, but I do believe that we need more multi-stakeholder collaboration, much like we've done here in the region around academia, private, public sector to keep pace with this disruption. And then ultimately, I think it's really about building healthy organizations and more resilient communities. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Katie, to talk a little bit about how you've seen COVID impact some of the changes that we were seeing BC before COVID.
Thanks, Simon. So we've spent a fair bit of time since middle of March talking to our coalition partners, and like many of you on the webcast with us today, understanding what's happening in the market and what some of our leading thinkers are doing and saying and predicting. What we've found, like many of you, is that coronavirus has put us into an acute health and wealth crisis. And it's something that needs to be survived because it is so acute and because it is so deep. And we look at it from a couple of different angles. One, health. We have hyper concern over our physical health because we're fighting this invisible enemy. We also are taking more stock of our overall physical health because we know what the virus is doing to folks with underlying health conditions. We're seeing an acute mental health challenge across the globe as people are working from home or who have underlying conditions again, and they're feeling general stress and anxiety where they might not have had to before. And we're also seeing spots of gathering where people could choose to go and find community being swiftly taken away. So think places of worship, barbershops, restaurants, salons, etc. Second, when we look at it from a financial or a wealth perspective, there's this increased need for income security. So think back to where we said over 500,000 people at minimum went for EI benefits. Now suddenly people are having to use social services where they didn't have to before, such as food banks, or are struggling to figure out, how do I put food on the table for my family? Where we thought we were okay before and probably didn't need benefits, we're finding that we do now, and we need benefits offered in a way that makes sense for us in our particular juncture in life. And when we think about COVID, it's a life moment. We're hearing that over and over and over again. It's really a moment for all of us collectively to pause and to think about what is important and what's not, and then how does that translate into our new go forward mindsets and behaviors. As we start to think about recovery and transition to the new normal, we start to think about, as employers and leaders in our organization, how do the workplaces need to adapt and thrive in the new normal when it's ready to go? And there's a couple trends that we think will continue to sustain as we move in. One, the increased need for values-based employment and decision-making. It's a way for us to stop and take stock of intentionally what comes back into our life and what will stay out post the coronavirus. So it will likely change our buying habits, the way we spend our time, the way we choose to contribute and earn an income, and who we spend our time with. Second, increased need for income stability and health benefits. Where Simon was talking about that emerging model before, the prediction is that that is now reality because we're going to be more intentional around our values and what comes in and what comes out of our life. That emerging model of work and life is now a reality. But how do I do it in a way that provides me with the stability, the security, the protection that I need in order for me to live the life that I want? We'll also start to see people look for workplaces and partners that really focus on all three pillars of health, so physical, mental, and financial. The other trends that we're starting to see too are multiple life and career transition as integration becomes that much more important, and as we move into a values-based system. What's interesting too is that learning where before it was thought of as something that was niche or nice to have, or I need to take a day off to do, it now has to be part of our daily focus so that we not only keep our skills up, but it's a way for us to get that protection and that income stability that we have wanted before. So whether that's 5 minutes a day in microburst learning of information and skills, micro-credentialing, whatever that looks like, it's important for us to do it. When we think about over 54% of us will need to have fundamentally new skills by 2022, when you translate that back, that's really only a few minutes a day for all of us. And so that has now become essential for us to being able to continue our employment. We looked at some of the folks across the market, and there's a couple of bellwethers who we wanted to bring to your attention for the sake of the conversation. So Mark Carney has talked about the importance of the integration of our financial, economic, psychological, and societal systems. Juliet KM, who's a former advisor for the Department of Homeland Security, has said this thing might last months, if not years, for us to feel normal again or back to normal. Francis Donald, the chief economist at Manulife, has talked about we can turn manufacturing plants back on, we can start to produce stuff again, which is great. However, people's behaviors and mindsets are likely slower to shift when they feel like their personal safety is at risk. And the other person who we really wanted to highlight, because I think she really sits on the premise that our coalition believes, is around the notion that community has to come together for all of us to benefit, is Heather McGowan. And so she says the coronavirus is creating an inflection point. Where we go from here is up to us. We have focused on the me over the we to our peril. This is our call to action. When we think about the potential impact on the workplace, I know many organizations are starting to think about what does it look like when we come back to physical work? Will we have everybody back in physical work? Will we stay remote? I think what we're finding in our conversations with our coalition partners, and perhaps you're finding this too, is that no one knows what post-COVID is going to look like. We can make predictions and we can heed government's advice, but no one's really certain about what this is going to look like. What we are certain of, however, is if we all bring our collective viewpoints to the table and we work on it together around what are the considerations that we need to think about, we believe firmly that we'll be in a much better place than that if we were to embark on this on our own. When we think about what the workplace might look like, we will have a new focus on value creation. Where will we invest our time and our money in order to create value for our customers, our shareholders, and our employees? We will likely have to rethink the value of our open and collaborative spaces for physical safety, but not lose sight of why they were developed and designed in the first place, for those collision moments and innovation. We'll likely also see very different employment constructs than that which we've seen before with respect to on-demand talent versus the foundation and core employee group that you need, as well as a shift in cultures from two values and employee experience and adaptability, perhaps more than we've seen in the past. It makes us want to get your opinions on what should our top priorities be as we think about coming back to work. We're going to ask you to provide your input into the chat function to provide the perspective. And what we'll do is we'll take all of your viewpoints, analyze them together, and then share them back out with you after the webinar today. Simon?
Yeah, so I'd encourage you to really use this opportunity to, provide your thoughts on where do you think that communities should be focusing. Part of what we did was we, initially started this coalition as a regional coalition, and we expanded to other communities. I'll call it the communities of the willing, who reached out to us, who were interested in partaking in tackling the future of work themselves. So again, Halifax and Windsor. We're starting to hear from other communities like Calgary and Winnipeg who have said, you know what, this is something that we should be thinking about and talking about within our community, and how do we actually collaborate in a way to bring those voices across sectors into the conversation. So gathering some of the priorities that you have here is, again, another data point for us to take a look at. And it's all about finding common priorities that we can work on and share across our community and to other communities as well. So thank you for doing that. So what I'm going to do is spend a bit of time, and thank you, Katie, for really those insights. I think, again, it gives you a bit of a sense of where we were, BC, and where we are AC, and some of the factors that are emerging. Again, I think that it's important to recognize that different organizations will be at different stages of their survival and of their transition. And, in the conversations that I've had with a lot of the organizations here in town, what I found is that the larger organizations have started to think about now contemplating what recovery might look like, while small to medium-sized companies are really still struggling with survival and survival and figuring out how to maintain and keep their businesses going. So I think there's a real opportunity for us to work with some of the organizations who have maybe the mind share, the brain space right now to think about what that recovery looks like and package it in a way that we can use to help small to medium-sized companies with their transition and really take that community-based approach. So just to give you a couple of examples to just bring this all to life, a couple of examples that we've seen here, again, happening in our region, but happening in many, many regions across Canada. You've got 3 different organizations in 3 different sectors, and they're just approaching it and they're pivoting what they're doing to help their customers, students, and their employees to adapt very quickly to what's going on. So the University of Waterloo, as you can imagine, they are the largest co-op program in North America, and they have over 7,000 employers. So for them in March to actually pivot from an in-person environment to a virtual environment is a significant transition and requires a lot of effort. And obviously the universities and colleges like Laurier and Conestoga did the same thing. But what they did, what I thought was interesting was, as they were making this pivot, Waterloo decided to send out a survey to students and to employers to understand what that transition experience looked like, with the purpose of really trying to understand what the changes were from a social interaction standpoint. And they did this across disciplines. So what they've done now is, as they're capturing that information, they're actually going to take that information and use it as a way to look at how do we develop programs to support potentially a virtual work environment for students and employers come September, because that will be another period of time where we'll have another cohort going in to the workplace. What does that look like? And they're going to use this as data points to look at what are new work integrated learning models that we can develop and pilot here in the region. The other thing they've done, which I thought was brilliant, was they stood up. So they stood up and they're hiring 320 students for this spring semester where they don't have a current placement, and they're going to leverage those students to actually work remotely to put content online, which I thought was a great use of the talent that we have in hand. Morneau Chappelle, for those who are familiar with Morneau Chappelle, they're a global HR and wellness provider. They made, in talking to DJ at Morneau, who's part of the coalition, she talked about how they actually quickly had to pivot their workforce to work from home. So they almost have 100% of their workforce now working from home, and they had to roll out Microsoft Teams to 6,000 employees in a matter of weeks versus months. They've also, true to their spirit and true to their purpose of kind of focusing on, well-being and overall well-being and mental health, they introduced some very interesting team competitions. Apparently they had a pet costume contest, they had talent shows, and one of the most interesting ones I thought was something called Wellbeing Wednesdays, where they took to Facebook Live and they actually did 30-minute segments on to help to promote positive physical well-being, mental well-being, financial well-being, and social well-being. And it was so successful that they actually took it public and have had 10,000 views in April. So again, taking things that they have and they've actually offered it to the public for the betterment of society and for to tackle COVID-19. The City of Waterloo, in talking to Kristen in the City of Waterloo, they just released an interactive map that highlights where restaurants are still open to help promote small to medium-sized businesses. So we can see which restaurants in Waterloo region are still available for pickup and curbside delivery. So you're seeing these acts of organizations quickly changing their model to adapt to what's going on. And I think it's fantastic to see how communities can come together and organizations can come together. Not only are we seeing this within industry sectors, but we're actually starting to see this collaboration across industry sectors, particularly on the healthcare side of things. So again, many examples across the country, but a couple in the region. One is around a company called Inksmith, and the other one is a company called TrustCore. And so what both of these organizations did was they realized that they had an asset, they were producing something, and they decided that in talking and collaborating with the healthcare sector, they thought they could actually develop solutions to help with the current pandemic. So Inksmith, they actually pivoted from making robotic kits for educators to making face shields to augment the local supply of PPEs for healthcare workers based on a conversation with the doctor. And it's amazing to think in the span of just over 30 days, Inksmith has gone from 10 employees to 150 employees. They're going to be over 300 employees in a few weeks. And on Friday, they just got a contract from the federal government for 10 million reusable face shields. Another example is TrustCore. So there's a local serial entrepreneur here, Dave Caputo, was the former CEO of Sandvine. He met with his startup company called TrustCore. They're in the sustainable building materials industry. And they were having a meeting about how to deal with COVID. And the meeting turned into how do we actually help and reposition our factories to make products for hospitals. And so within a couple of days, they spun up 4 prototypes in working with one of the local hospitals, a couple of local hospitals here. And they actually created 6x8 panels, and you can see them in the picture there, that enable hospitals to actually portion off or wall off COVID-19 patients from those with other medical ailments. And they provided these panels to the hospitals at no cost. So these are just some quick examples of organizations that are rallying around a common cause and trying to figure out a way to provide a better solution to move things forward as we think about COVID. So as we continue to be dealing with this current crisis, and we think about what recovery might look like, I wonder how we might quickly collaborate to help shape the future of work within our communities. You know, one of the things that we're contemplating here in Waterloo region is whether we can actually create a collaborative or peer-to-peer around getting people back to work. So the repatriation of the workforce. What are some of the safety measures? So what does social distancing look like? What about contact tracing, testing, et cetera? These are all things that the various industries are thinking about today. And you know, you've seen there's a lot of people that are already starting to publish plans about repatriation back to work. But I wonder if there's an opportunity for us to look, again, across industries to share best practices on how we might do this together, and also take those learnings, as I said, to help the small to medium-sized businesses within our communities who don't necessarily have the mind share or are in the position today to be thinking about some of those things. So again, just as an opportunity there to consider. You know, we've talked a lot about this pace of change and how things are moving quickly. I think really what we're saying is we think we need a different model in order to keep pace with the changes ahead. I love this diagram by Tom Friedman. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning author and journalist. He was the keynote speaker at our True North conference. I may have a mild crush on him. So he actually plotted a very interesting view on the relationship between human adaptability and technology. And what he contends is that we have officially passed the point where humans can adapt to the rate of change. And we actually have to look at new models of learning faster and governing smarter to move forward. And I believe in that. But what I think has been interesting is in the last 6 weeks, we've seen, or like 6 to 7 weeks, I guess, what we've seen is what I'm calling the Kovac Bump, right? And this bump is this massive shift in adaptability. Look at how much we've changed in the last 6 weeks. Look at how we're interacting with each other. So it's in us to be able to adapt. But what I worry about is if we don't adapt together and we don't create a path collectively forward, it's going to be very challenging for people and organizations to deal with this change on their own, because it's a very ambiguous future. And we, and I think we really need a way to work together to actually collaborate and get ahead of some of these changes that we're seeing in front of us. So I'm going to turn it back over to Katie. She's going to summarize kind of what this means and what the path might look like moving forward.
Thanks, Simon. So what does this actually mean? What can we do in our own communities, whether it's Waterloo Region or elsewhere, for everybody on the phone or on the webinar with us today, in order to choose a better future for us all? So one, we believe firmly that we need to work together across traditional, often self-imposed boundaries for us to be able to be successful and create a better future for us post the coronavirus. We also believe that this is a national challenge. We will see, of course, regional and sectoral differences as you think about moving from the Pacific Ocean all the way over to the Atlantic Ocean. But we're finding that industry doesn't matter. And Simon gave us a couple of really good examples of how organizations are pivoting and adjusting their deliverables and their products to be able to suit the current need of the marketplace. When we think about what we need in order for this to be successful, as Simon said, we need that system-wide approach to the future of work and learning that is adaptable and able to scale up and down as we start to realize those regional differences. But we do need that national conversation. We need continued collaboration across academia, public and private sectors. And when we think about private sectors, it's really important for all voices and all industries to be at that table. I can't tell you the amount of value our coalition is getting from hearing from our small and medium businesses and our large organizations across a multitude of industries. When we start to share learnings together and insights and ask questions, we all walk away from the table with a much more profound answer than that which we would have had we had that conversation on our own or within our own organizations. We are looking to continue to create that common playbook across the nation so we can share learnings with each other. When Halifax has just launched its Future of Work and Learning Coalition, they will no doubt come up with great and fantastic ideas. How can they share their learnings with coalitions like ourselves and others as we start to pick it up? So why not create that national conversation and learn together? The other thing that we're finding and that we think we will need even more of and really quickly is a testbed for pilots where learnings can be shared across the system and where we can pilot things that we thought only obscure or weird or way too far out there before. We also do believe that we need a two-way conversation with policymakers to help co-create the future and one that's better for all Canadians. And we believe that we will succeed because the only way for us to keep up with the pace of change and the added complexity is for us to learn together, to collaborate and co-create our future. Second, and this is something that our coalition feels very strongly about, and it's been part of our mandate since the beginning, is this belief that healthy workforces and healthy workplaces will build resilient communities where people want to come to play, to learn, to contribute, and to prosper. And we believe now more than ever that we need to leverage our collective spirit from the coronavirus to rebuild and our community and our economies.
So in closing, we often get asked, what problem are you trying to solve for, or what opportunity lies ahead? And really, we just kind of summarize it in this problem statement. We believe the future of work is really, it's a complicated and a complex challenge. It requires swift action. We don't think one single stakeholder can solve it on its own. And we believe that there's a place, it's not the solution, it's one of the solutions, is a community-based coalition model where we can build healthy workplaces in resilient communities. And today more than ever, I think we, because of the coronavirus, I think we need that collaboration. And it's not really anymore about just building healthy workplaces and resilient communities. I think it's actually about rebuilding workplaces and rebuilding resilient communities. So I just like to really thank our Future of Work and Learning Coalition partners for their partnership, for their sponsorship, for leading the charge and continuing this important conversation around the future of work. As you can see from these organizations, it's really it's a collective of very eclectic group of organizations, all from the academic side of things, private sector organizations of all sizes, and public sector organizations and community organizations who are trying to lead the charge on this. Because I think really what it comes down to is the future of work. It really is now. So before we move to the Q&A portion of the webcast, I just want to remind people to mark their calendars for the next webcast, which is May 19th at 11 a.m. We're going to be joined by global thought leader and future of work strategist Heather McGowan and Carol Lehman, who's the CEO of Exonify, which is a local learning software pioneer. Heather is actually who Tom Friedman turns to as his guru for the future of work, and she recently co-authored a book called The Adaptation Advantage. Just got released. If you have a chance to pick it up, it's a great book. She's going to provide us with her perspective on the future of work and the impacts of COVID-19, particularly around the areas of leadership and company culture. What do you need to be able to survive and thrive moving forward? And again, we're sticking with that theme of how is COVID impacting the future of work, but this theme will really be around leadership and company culture. I think that'll be relevant for a lot of people who are on the webcast. Carol and Exonify, interestingly enough, are actually referenced in Heather's book, The Adaptation Advantage, as an example of leadership and company culture that's going to excel in the future. So Carol and Heather are going to share their perspectives and experiences with us, which I think is going to be fantastic. So I'd encourage you to sign up. The webinar is up for registration, and please help us promote this awesome event. So now let's open things up for our Q&A for the next, hey, we're right on time, Katie, imagine that.
So Simon, Sharon has a really interesting question that I think you'll be really excited to answer. She's wondering what changes, if any, do you think will take place within our primary and secondary education system to properly prepare our kids for the future of work? Colin adds to the conversation by saying we need to switch from fact-based learning to actually learning how to learn. Can you
so I think it's really,
on that?
Yeah, so I'll provide my perspective, Katie, and I'd love to hear yours as well. We've had actually the K-12 group really reach out to us and say, like, what role can we play? And so I think what we're going to see is that, really a migration of basically things that you could find on Google, right? I oftentimes say the things that you learn, if you can actually just find it on Google, while important, I don't know that that's necessarily what's going to be important down the road, because I think it's really going to be those skills of learning, unlearning, and finding new models that are going to work. And then I think another piece is going to be that we'll need to instill within the K-12 is this whole sense of curiosity. I think we need to be able to ensure that kids are figuring out how to learn on their own, figuring out, what are all the resources that are available to them, and then start really promoting more of that critical thinking, innovative thinking, and I think there'll be more around those human skills. So right now, obviously, our teachers are working very hard to migrate to this virtual and digital platform. I think that's kind of the immediate transition that's going to happen, is that our schools are going to have to work in a new virtual and online manner, which I think we're all trying to do. But I think as they see, how things are going to evolve, I think there'll be more of that discussion around more inquiry-based learning, curiosity, and then a lot more, I think, in that work integrated learning. I do think that the hands-on learning is going to be something we'll see a lot more of in the future.
It's interesting, Simon. So what we're seeing in a lot of Scandinavian countries, they start even as early as, kindergarten or grade 1, to think about how they want to contribute in society. So they start even those career and contribution conversations straight out the gate as someone is just embarking on their school career. And what I love is they don't think about it from a job or a career, or what do you want to get out of it? It's what contribution do you want to make to society? And that conversation scales with them all the way through their entire school career. And what they're finding, as I think they're even doing some 10-year studies, is that as the market shifts and as jobs are gained and lost and as they choose to live their life in different ways, that thread of what contribution do I want to make allows them to be more resilient through the changes, and allows them to feel stronger and more productive as they're moving through their life. Simon, we have another interesting conversation, and I think it ties back to your notion of overall life and career, and how that will shift when you think about the new emerging model. So Fatima is wondering, do you think there will be a place for mature people who want to go back to work in the new model after COVID, since the financial stress has been felt by everyone?
Well, I think it's going to be very interesting, because we talk a bit about those multiple demographics within the workplace. And so I would say that what I've seen is that organizations have really focused in on, getting the digital skills, and maybe lunged a little bit at, younger workers who can bring this new, the new skills around digital and innovation. But I think we're missing, and we need to make sure that we create a right balance, because when I look at, being at Community Tech, we see a lot of organizations that start up who have people that are really, really good when it comes to technology. These young students, these young minds are very, very bright in what they bring to the table. But oftentimes what I see is they don't necessarily have the business side of things, right? And the other parts that make up growing businesses and scaling businesses. You do need, some experience around leadership and business fundamentals. What does sales and marketing look like? How do you manage products, et cetera? So I think there's a real opportunity for us to take the best of both worlds, which is ensure that we have folks that, obviously, as we continue to help, I think there's going to be a baseline of digital skills that everyone's going to need to a certain degree, right? But I don't think everybody needs to become a programmer, right? That's not necessarily what we need. Is 100% of one thing versus the other. I think it's more of a balance, and so I do think that there'll be some core fundamental skills. But I think for workers who have more experience, people who are more mature, they bring a lot to the table because they've seen what's happened before, and they can provide those insights, and you can provide that wisdom in terms of how do you actually balance running a business by and focusing on the problem or focusing on the customer challenge that we're trying to solve for, and then infusing that technology there to help make it efficient and modern, but you still need to be able to understand how those businesses operate.
Thanks, Simon. Shannon asks, what willingness is there for employers to reinvent job design? So many jobs are still designed as full-time and requiring an enormous amount of specialization with 10+ years in that sector. Will companies begin to rethink role design in a more agile way?
So I'll give my 2 cents, and Katie, I'd love to hear your perspective on that. What I would say is that I think job descriptions, role designs, et cetera, while important, I think you're going to see it become much more fluid. One of the organizations within our coalition, Plum, is a good example of an organization that looks at not just the typical things that you would look at when you look at a resume or you look at a job posting, but it helps people actually understand what are some of their human skills and what are their innate skills that are transferable. And I think you're going to see more of that, whereby it's not necessarily that you need to have 10 years of experience. It's about, can you do the job and can you learn? I think those are things that we're going to migrate to a little bit more. Of course, there's going to be certain roles that are specialized and do require a certain amount of tenure. But I think because the world is so fluid and ambiguous, I think we're going to be in a world where the currency is, can someone learn? Are they able to learn something quickly and rapidly and apply those learnings, and be able to take the skills that they have from one particular job or industry and apply it to another one? Katie, I'd love to hear your perspective on that as the head of HR for Manulife.
Yeah, so I'll share the thoughts from a market perspective when we talk about our coalition. What we're finding too is organizations our constructs are shifting. So where before we were quite hierarchical, think sort of boxes and sticks that you would have learned when you were going through college or university. But what we're finding now is it's more of a social network. And so that hierarchy doesn't necessarily matter anymore. It's the function that you can provide. It's the contribution you want to make. To Simon's point, it's the willingness to learn and to roll up your sleeves and to go for it, to experiment, to make mistakes. So we are seeing more, I wouldn't call it fluidity necessarily, but I would call it a new emerging model of how organizations operate and how they look to bring teams together or for people to fill a particular need in the organization that is more fluid than it ever was before.
The only thing else I'll add to that, Katie, just because I know the second part of that question was just around the acceptance of different models of working.
Mm-hmm.
I think that traditionally what you would have heard as a bit of a barrier to things like, working part-time or working with a freelancer or et cetera. I think with COVID, I think what's accelerated is the recognition that you can work remotely. You can work with distributed and dispersed teams. Right. And I think that we're recognized that, like talent isn't necessarily just around the corner anymore because of the fact that we're virtual and global. You can access talent in many different places. And I think it's also going to create creativity in terms of how we look at work. And as we get into recovery, I think that, let's be honest, I think organizations are going to have to manage their costs. And so how do they look at more flexible models in different ways to be able to maintain their workforce and continue to engage their workforce while managing those costs? I'll give you a simple example. GM announced a couple of weeks ago that they are taking they've offered a salary deferral program. So basically what they do is they allow people to work a 4-day work. They go down and they pay them for basically 4 days, and they defer that fifth day for down the road. And they're actually paying interest on that. So again, it's just a way for you to look at how do you manage things in a more fluid way. I've heard our organizations looking very seriously at job share as a way to be able to, again, we have a lot of people at home who are managing young children at home. And so is there an opportunity to do a job share whereby they can actually, spend some time with their kids and manage their lives appropriately? Those are conversations that I don't think we necessarily had as pervasively pre-COVID, but I think you're going to see more of those models emerge in the next few months and years.
Awesome, thanks, Simon. I think we'll take our last question from Camille. There's a fair number of them still in our backlog, so we'll make sure we get to them through our Future of Work newsletter, and we'll respond out after this event. So Camille's question is a really great one, and I'll kick this off, Simon, and I'll ask you to add on. But she's wondering, the strong connections with peers has continued to be an integral part of engagement and satisfaction to our job. How are we thinking about the need for friendship post-COVID? And it's a really interesting question, Camille. So Willis Towers Watson just put out a study, I want to say a couple of days ago, where employers are seeing 84, 85%. They're saying that there's actually stronger engagement around in their organizations now during and post-COVID. So there's something that this urgency and this acute shift has created in the organizations from a culture and a team perspective. And so how do we continue that dynamic? How do we continue that connection post-COVID is a question that a lot of organizations are grappling with. And we're even starting to see in our survey models, people asking for questions like, do you have a best friend at work? Someone that you trust, someone that you can be open with. So we're starting to see that need for friendship, even in our programmatic responses to employee engagement and satisfaction. What's interesting too is U of W just recently launched their research on the next generation of workforce, and a lot of their students who responded and said, listen, like I want to work at a place where I'm doing really good stuff, but with colleagues that feel more like friends. And so where we've talked about that interdependency and interconnection between work and life post-COVID, that is absolutely going to continue to be a part of it, and something that I think as employers we'll need to consider. So how do you have that friendship, but also that professional nature as we're working on something together? Simon, I don't know if you want to add in our final minute together.
No, I think that I think you're absolutely right. We're seeing it across the board, right? We're seeing, virtual drinks at the end of the day, and a real intentionality to check in with members of our team. And I'm not saying we didn't do that before, but I think that COVID has really forced leaders and all of us to be checking in on each other. And yes, we're working in a virtual environment, but I wonder how we can maintain that when we go back to, a blend of in-person and remote. And I think this is, again, the notion of what we're talking about is this neighbor helping neighbor, and how do we actually bring together people and create a sense of community within an organization and then within an actual community. And I think that's the challenge ahead for us, is that I think COVID's taught us that it's going to be pretty hard for us to do this by ourselves. And I think leaning in and supporting each other, whether it be on a personal level or within an organization or within communities across Canada, I think that's the path forward.
Perfect. Thanks, Simon.
So thank you, everybody, for your time today. We really appreciate it, taking parts of your Monday afternoon to spend time with us. And we look forward to seeing you again on May the 19th. Thank you very much.